I'm Adam Pascarella, and welcome to episode 32 of The Power of Bold.
From New York City, it's The Power of Bold, the podcast on risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and bold living. Join us as we interview world-class performers, analyze life-changing books, and gather actionable insights to help you achieve your goals. Here's your host, Adam Pascarella.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to The Power of Bold. So for today's show, I'm excited to share my conversation with Ryder Carroll. Ryder is a digital product designer who developed the Bullet Journal, which is a widely popular system that can help you get organized and can help you accomplish your goals. If you haven't yet heard of the Bullet Journal, Ryder describes it as a way to track the past, organize the present, and plan for the future. It is a part to-do list, part journal that you can use to help you accomplish virtually whatever task or goals in front of you. That said, no matter your agenda, the Bullet Journal offers a wide array of universal benefits. It can help you get organized, obtain clarity about your goals, figure out what's truly important in your life, and help you break through inertia and live life on your own terms. Compared to other productivity systems, the Bullet Journal is an analog rather than digital system. It only requires a simple notebook, a pen or pencil, and your time. And many people rave about it. Simply put, the Bullet Journal method is a global phenomenon. Users from around the world have gathered on social media to form bullet journal communities, where they share their creations and how they have customized their own bullet journals. I was excited to speak with Ryder about the Bullet Journal and his newly released book titled The Bullet Journal Method, which is a deep dive into bullet journaling and how it can work for you. We had a free-ranging conversation, touching on topics like why and how Ryder created the bullet journal system, the psychological barriers he had to face when sharing the bullet journal, how the bullet journal can help us eliminate the unnecessary in our lives, and how the bullet journal can give us the tools to accomplish our goals. It was a great conversation that I know you'll enjoy. Okay, without further ado, here's Ryder Carroll. Ryder Carroll, thanks so much for joining me on The Power of Bold.
Thank you for having me.
So Ryder, you've developed an awesome system for helping others become more productive and to get things done. And the purpose of this podcast is to help others not only think about risk-taking and bold living, but to actually take action to realize those dreams. And so because of this, it's really great having you on the show because I truly think that the Bullet Journal can be a massive tool to help our listeners accomplish whatever goal they may have. So we're going to talk about the Bullet Journal and how it can help listeners in a bit. But before that, I'd like to spend some time speaking about your story and how you actually developed the Bullet Journal. So let's just start here. Before you created the first version of the Bullet Journal, were you someone that was really interested in productivity or journaling or those sort of things?
Well, I created the Bullet Journal as a response to a need. When I was really young, I was diagnosed with ADD, and back then they really didn't have a lot of tools available to help, not necessarily correct, but help overcome challenges that come with that diagnosis. And I started designing my own techniques and methodologies and tricks to help overcome the things that I felt were really challenging that it seemed that my fellow students did not. So I guess from a very early age, I had a pretty important realization, which is that you have more power than one may think to helping yourself, right? Generally speaking, when you're a kid and you grow up, you're kind of like beholden to your teachers and your parents to enable you to do anything, right? So from that point onward, I kind of focused in on developing these methodologies, and most of them didn't work, right? But some of them did, and some of them had a really big impact on my life and the way that I was able to remain focused and figure out what was important and prioritize, and all these qualities that somebody with ADD is not supposed to be able to do, right? And then once I got older and I started actually studying design, I started implementing a lot of those elements into the way that I took notes and the way that I got organized. And as I became a more seasoned designer, I just enjoyed that process of designing systems. Like in general, like I'd been doing it for so long, and I was like learning about things and actually being able to iterate more on the tools that I had created to help myself. And that's pretty much where it all began. So started with a problem. Over many, many years, I refined the tools and techniques that I had developed. And then eventually I studied design, and then I became a digital product designer. And then that was like a whole new world of information and different methodologies. And I would take what I found to be useful and implement them in my own, which was ironic because the bullet journal was entirely analog.
Yeah,
but,
right.
It's all systems thinking. So for me, that systems thinking has always been really interesting, and user experience, if you will, like what tools actually help us move forward as opposed to stand in our way.
And in the beginning, when you're experimenting, trying out different productivity systems, developing your own, what were some of the roadblocks in doing that? Or I guess in other words, what were some of the main problems you were seeing in other productivity systems that you fixed in your own?
There are a lot. So I'm trying to figure out what were the big ones. I mean, first of all, I had to accept the fact that there was no tool that could do everything, right? And I feel like when a lot of people are looking for a productivity system or any kind of methodology, they're like, this is the one and only, and, I'm going to sign up for this and then everything will be easy. And to me, that was never the case, right? There would always be something where it would fall short, or more often something would work really great for one application or one season of my life. And then when I moved on either to a different job or a different location or something, like it just wouldn't work anymore. Then I was like trying to hold on to it because it had proved itself useful at one point, but now things were falling through the cracks. So for me, a big part of the bullet journal is that I designed it in a way that's modular. Mm-hmm. So you can essentially design your own tools and plug them into this modular framework. And for those who aren't familiar, I think an easy way of conceptualizing the bullet journal is as a Lego set, where each piece serves a very specific function. But in addition, you're also encouraged to design your own pieces and snap them together with the other pieces so they all play off each other in this productivity ecosystem. Now, that being said, another big hurdle that I had, again, was like, you buy all into one system. If it doesn't work, people tend to stick to it, right? They stick to it until it's become so painful that they kind of jump onto another island and then another one. One thing for me was like starting to actually deconstruct my needs, right? And like accept that this is a tool for this is a tool for that, this is a tool for that, and not trying to shoehorn them all into one system. I mean, it's nice to have one clean, wholesome tool that would do everything, but in my experience, those things just don't exist just because we have incredibly complicated needs. So the bullet journal just happens to be a system that addresses many things, right? But not all of them. It's like you don't email with the bullet journal. You're not going to be scheduling conference calls with the bullet journal. So for me, it was about figuring out the ecosystem of tools that actually allowed me to be more productive. I never think that it's digital versus analog. It's like they're just both tools, and we have to use whatever helps us become more effective.
Right. And do you maybe have a story of when you were developing the bullet journal of how malleable it was and how you, like you said, you combined these Lego blocks together to accomplish some goal or task you had? And again, maybe in the beginning when you're developing it, can you share a story back then?
Sure. Let me see. How about the development of bulletjournal.com? That would be a very simple one. When I had this approach. That's like the best way I can put it, right? It's morphed into a methodology, but originally it was just basically a whole bunch of different ideas that I would just use to get organized in my notebook. And when I decided to make it public, I had to figure out a way to make it significantly more understandable. So I had to develop terminology. I had to think about visuals that would show people how to use it, because it's a very visual system. Doesn't mean you have to be an artist, but like, it's pen and paper, and there are different kinds of charts and lists and so forth. So essentially I started deconstructing what the site would have to accomplish. Not to mention, it's like, oh, well, it should have a name. It should have a name. So like I create a collection, which is one of these Lego pieces, if you will. Conceptually, bullet journals filled with different kinds of collections. So one collection was just about figuring out a name, writing down words, and then like associations, brain maps, if you will, those kind of things, association charts. And then once I had a name, like, okay, what's that logo going to look like? So I had another collection for starting to try different kinds of lettering and different forms and shapes that I would use to actually create the logo. And of course, then there was also the terminology for the system. So again, just writing down different words and like looking things up and seeing how I could describe things. Like I tried to use vocabulary that people are already familiar with, just like with a twist. Like, for example, some of the words we use in the methodology, like migration and logs and index, page numbers, bullets, like all these things are words that you already know, and so you're already halfway there to understanding before you even know how it all fits together. So that kind of thing. So you have how to name the company. What's the logo going to look like? And then, of course, a really important part is actually doing all the wireframing for the website. How are you going to teach an analog methodology through a digital platform, through a digital medium, right? So like figuring out those problems, and I could just like work through it really quickly by drawing out different scenarios over and over again in my notebook. So all these different pieces of the same project lived in the notebook. And that's like one easy example of how I used different templates, if you will, to organize very different components, all of one project.
Yeah, that's a cool story. And again, like you said, it goes to show how the bullet journal can really be suited to your needs, whatever they are. You can create these customized collections when you're a bit more advanced with the system, and use them to accomplish your goals. And I guess traveling back to that time, I feel like a lot of people are hesitant to share their own side projects or systems with others, and they're pretty personal to some people. Were you nervous about sharing your bullet journal system with your friends and family? And if so, how did you manage that fear?
The short answer is absolutely. I mean, you have to understand that the bullet journal was born from a place of, I designed it to help me fix what I perceive to be a pretty severe disability, right? So there's a lot of self-consciousness involved. Like, I didn't really want to advertise the fact that I had all these challenges. Like, here, look at all the things that I'm not good at. That you don't really put that thread together. You don't advertise those things. And the first time I actually shared it was with a friend, and it was almost like a mistake or like an accident. Mm-hmm. Planning her wedding, and her desk at her office was just completely covered with scraps of paper and notebooks and color swatches, and she was like looking for a note that was really important, and she lost it. And I'm like, well, I know what it's like to try to organize yourself and be less frantic, and I've been doing it for a very long time. So I don't know, out of nowhere I was like, hey, if you want to, I can show you how I use my notebook. It might help you get organized. And like, to my horror, she's like, sure, that sounds great. Like, an inspector to actually take me up on the offer. I was like, and as soon as she said yes, I was like, oh no, what would I get myself into this time? So I sat down with her and I kind of stumbled my way through it, because I had never had to articulate the way that I thought before. Right. And that's a really interesting exercise, especially because this is something that I thought about so much and I had been working on for so long. It's like, it was second nature. It's very hard for you to explain something to somebody who has no idea of something that's second nature to you, right? Because you don't consider it. It's just, like trying to explain to somebody how, I don't know, you walk, right? For me, like, bullet journaling was just the way I operated. So it was really hard for me to kind of like pull myself out of it and explain it in a way that could be comprehensible to another person.
What did you learn through that process, through explaining it to her?
Well, first of all, that it was really like agonizing, just like as I was explaining it and as I was trying to actually come up with the vocabulary on the fly, I was like, wow, this is really hard to explain. And when I was done, it took me about half an hour. And when I looked up at her like mouth was hanging open. I'm like, oh no, she thinks I'm completely nuts. And the first thing she said is, you have to share this with people. Mm-hmm. And that kind of flipped the switch. It never occurred to me that these things that I had come up with could actually be helpful to others. I never took that leap creatively, Like this was designed for the way that my faulty mind worked.
And before that moment, you never thought to share it with anyone, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I hardly shared it with her, It was just like, oops, okay, here I am. But over time, like I was wondering if that was a fluke. Maybe for her this was really helpful. But then I would start sharing pieces with other people. Like I'd see somebody struggling with something, and I'd show them how I use my notebook to address this. I feel really overwhelmed. It's like, okay, let's sit down for a second. Like, what are all the things you're working on? What are the things that are actually adding value to your life? What are the things that just because something can be done doesn't mean that it needs to be done. And that's a concept that people aren't comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. Like keeping endless task lists just because there's comfort in that. Like it gives you the illusion of control and order. It's like, oh, it's on my list, but those lists, like if you don't actually engage with those lists, they just become meaningless. It's just like another way of hoarding.
Sure.
So over time, I just would show people I'd show them my solutions for solving very common problems. And a lot of times the response was pretty positive. Some people were like, either they were lukewarm or it was positive. There was never a time where people were like, I don't get it. That seems silly, or that doesn't work for me, and then that was interesting because usually I anticipated sharing this like very personal system with other people, and they'd look at me like, wow, it's just yeah. Like that's something, that's for sure. But no, overall, the response was positive, but what was really unexpected is that people would actually start using pieces.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Like maybe not the whole thing, but I'd come back and like, for example, the original friend, like she did it for years, right? It's just like, this piece or that piece, and this was before I had articulated it properly. Like what people see today is only what has worked over the long term, right? Mm-hmm. Like I used to use a lot more stuff, but when I finally decided to share with people, I just focused on the pieces that worked. And I think that made it much easier for me to share it. It's like, here are the best practices that I use. And if somebody else finds it helpful, then that's great. But to answer your original question, like how did I overcome the fear, is that I saw that it made a difference in somebody else's life. Like maybe it could be a silly small way, but it's like my insecurity going to get in the way of that. Mm-hmm. Like that's what changed my mind. It's still a battle till this day. Like there's especially with this book, there's like a lot of very personal information in there.
Sure.
And you have to ask yourself the questions, like, are you just going to be insecure about it? Or like, if you have even the opportunity to be able to provide something that could be useful to other people, like, I feel like that, for me, that argument is much easier to have, internally. Yeah. So you could sit on it, or you could help somebody potentially, it's like, okay, well, that makes it easier, at least for me.
Yeah. So keeping that higher objective in mind, like you said, just helping people improve their lives. That helped you get over the fear that you were facing. And now the bullet journal movement obviously has really taken off, and your methods have been written about in major publications. There's this new book that you're releasing. So what have been some of the most prominent things that you've learned about productivity or goals or even people's dreams from this experience?
Well, one is that you have to define them for yourself. I think that's something that we fail to do a lot because we're never taught to do that, right? At least in my own experience, generally speaking, when people are like, what are your goals? I'm like, oh, I'll just take whatever goals I've heard of, and just kind of substitute them in, right? It's like, oh, house, whatever, boat, money, whatever it is that you think are the goals, right? Or happiness. Like, to me, these are all kind of empty looking back on it. It started off with trying to be productive, but then it morphed into like, why am I doing these things to begin with? Like, what's the point? Like, and that realization happened before Bullet Journal came out, but I've worked as a digital product designer for over a decade. So I've worked with startups. I've launched a couple of my own, and there's few worse feelings in like your professional experience than putting everything you have into something just to realize that you don't care about it when you're done. Mm-hmm. Right. And that was a very hard lesson for me to have. Like, I had a startup with a friend of mine, and we worked for 2 years, day and night, put everything into it. And the process of building it was great. That was like super fun. Like, neither of us had ever taken a step back and be like, hey, do you actually like this product?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, is this the product you want to be associated with? And it seems like such a basic question. 2 years of your life, like, there it is. If the answer is no, that's something you could ask yourself ahead of time. Right. So for me, I would say the biggest part is like productivity is a means to an end. And I feel like it comes second to the work you need to do beforehand, which is in some ways a lot more existential. It doesn't have to be like diving down an existential rabbit hole, but just like having a better awareness of what it is that you actually find important. What do you believe in? What do you think actually matters? And then starting to figure out a way to align your actions with your beliefs, mm-hmm. as opposed to the other way around.
Exactly, and that's such an important point, and it goes to one of the main benefits of the bullet journal. And for those listeners that haven't yet heard of the bullet journal or know exactly what it is, it's probably best for them to go to bulletjournal.com and view your 5-minute tutorial there. But I think going back to that idea of kind of what's the point of what you're doing, I think the analog nature of the bullet journal really helps with that, and particularly the migration part when you're transferring goals from one month to the other. Because if you're not willing to spend 30 seconds to a minute transferring a goal, it's probably not that important, right? Is that one of the key benefits you see from the analog nature of it?
Yes. So a lot of people always are like, oh, I don't want to write things down, or that's going to take too much time. And like, that's not a bug, that's a feature, yeah. Right? In this case, like, I think we live in a time where we mistake convenience for efficiency too often. Like, yeah, it's much faster to type things. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that it isn't. But when it comes to trying to figure out what really matters to us and like how we feel about what we're doing, I feel like we have to slow down, and it might feel really unnatural, but at least with your notebook, it happens by virtue of its nature, like the material aspect of it, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to have to write this thing down. Is it worth writing down to begin with? And then copying it over. Why am I copying it over? Because it still adds value. How does it add value? And, like, you start thinking along these lines, mm-hmm. right? And you do it on a monthly basis, and over time, you start filtering out a lot of distractions naturally, because you're just asking yourself these questions. This isn't like some existential meltdown every day. You're just like, why does this matter? That's it. Like, why does it matter? And you don't have to go that deep. It matters because it'll move me forward towards something that I care about, or it'll help me accomplish a goal that like really interests me, or allows me, on a very simple, basic level, allows me to spend more time with something that I'm curious about. Like, maybe it won't be a passion. It doesn't have to be a huge goal, but it's like, I would like to learn more about this. That's why I'm reading this book, mm-hmm. or that's why I'm going to this seminar. Like, that's enough, but I feel like a lot of times we go through our to-do lists, and especially during migration, you go through all these things that you've tasked yourself with. And then some of it adds value to their life, and it will continue to do that, but not all of it. Like, it's very rare, even till this day, and I've been doing this like all my life. Till this day, I'll still have things on my list, and I'll be like, that doesn't need to be done. That just doesn't need to be done. And all of a sudden you start reclaiming time and energy.
Do you have an example of that? Maybe where you thought a task or goal was really important, and yet you were shocked that it really didn't matter in the end when you were doing this migration process?
Well, I mean, there are two ways to answer that question, right? On the one hand, there are things, I think that opportunities are the trickiest one, right? You write something down, it's like, you should email so-and-so because of X, Y, and Z. Like, maybe it's a new business lead, or like, you get some exposure or something like that. And it may work. You're kind of excited about it, but you kind of take it or leave it. And I feel like when I feel like that about any task, I get rid of it. Like, maybe it'll work out, and maybe, but like, if there are other things on my list that really excite me, and I'd rather put much more time and energy into, then the other ones kind of fade away, if that makes sense. They just go away. On the other hand, like, yeah, I've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy pursuing things that, like, I look back on and it's like, why did you do this? Mm-hmm. Like the reason you gave yourself was not really well considered, and I feel like a lot of that comes from the stories we tell ourselves, right? Like, you should do this, and like, should is a very dangerous word, because like, who, according to who?
Yeah.
Like, according to who, like, why should I do this? I mean, like, I'm not saying that you can never say should, but you have to be very careful when that word slips in somewhere. Like, are you telling yourself this because you believe it? Like, you should really, I don't know, do your taxes, or like, get an attorney. Like, those are valid, right? You should do that. But it's like, where's the origin of that should? Where's that story coming from? And that's something that, like, is something easy to forget in the rush of life, right? And it happens to me too. I'm by no means perfect. I just try to remind myself, like, where are my shoulds coming from? Like, why did I end up here? And that's a really important part for me as well, which is like, I'm not going to get into how failure is, an incredibly important part of this process. But for me, just to summarize it, I feel like failure is an immediate indication that there's a lesson that needed to be learned. Right. Yeah. And mm-hmm. with journaling, at least for me, it's like, okay, you did X did not work out. And it's not like that's the end of it. That's the beginning of it. Like, why did it not work out? What are you going to do differently next time? What small step can you do to correct this or avoid this in the future? And like, when that comes up next time, as it will, right, be like, I've thought about this a little bit. As opposed to just being like, oh no, and then just like letting it go.
Moving on, yeah. The reflection part is such a crucial step. And Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager in charge of Bridgewater, says that pain plus reflection equals progress. And I totally agree. The reflection part is extremely important. And yet people don't do it. Maybe they think they're not big journalers, or they don't have time to journal or meditate or some of these things like that. And even with the bullet journal, it's very easy to get started and to maintain. But for those listeners that maybe say, oh, I'm an organized person, I reflect, when I have time, but I don't write any of these things down. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I guess the simplest thing to say is then you'll probably forget.
Yeah.
Like, ideas and insights are really important. And I champion people to like do some introspection and reflection on a regular basis. But if they just remain ideas, it's like, how many ideas have you had in your life? You can't even count them. They're too many. And I would say most insight disappears. Right. So like, for me, the most critical aspect is like, how do you put that insight into action? How do you put that thought into action on a regular basis? It's like, I realize that I'm actually much more productive at night. Cool. I'm going to keep getting up at 4 a.m. because I read it somewhere on a blog, and have like this crazy, like, productive morning, and like realize that you're getting no sleep. You know what I mean? Like, You start figuring out what works for you. But like, you'll learn from experience, right? You'll learn from experience, but I feel like you'll do it much slower if you're not actually studying your experience.
Yeah, and is there a proper way to reflect? I guess I'm sure there isn't. People can reflect however they want, but in your experience doing this and hearing about the experiences of others, is there maybe a better way to reflect than what you would think?
Well, so I think like reflection is sort of a vessel that contains a lot of different perspectives, if you will, right? So the first part, like, I think the first aspect is to make reflection a habit, to build it into your days, to make it a consistent aspect. And like the first step is just like simply questioning what you're seeing. Like if you keep any kind of record of your day, you just kind of go through it in the morning and in the evening and be like, okay, maybe you just start with like, what do I still have to do? You know, like that's the simplest aspect. And then you start to build on that a little bit. What do I have to do? What is the priority? Why? Now that's you just getting into the habit of asking yourself small little questions on a consistent basis. I feel like when we ask ourselves these kind of questions, it can blow out of proportion really quickly. It's like, why am I doing anything? You know, like you don't want to get into that space. You know, it's not about having a meltdown. It's just like getting comfortable with asking small questions and having answers enough to move you to the next. But over time, reflection can deepen significantly based on what you bring into that time. So, for example, like one thing that I like to ask when I'm reflecting on the things that I'm working on is like, what can I control?
Yeah.
Like, what are the things that I'm tasking myself with that I can actually affect in like a real way? And it might seem like an odd question because it's like, oh, everything on your to-do list is something that, you know, you can do. And that's not incorrect, but to what end? Right? It's like, are my tasks lining up based on an outcome that I'm setting an expectation for? Or is it more along the lines of me basically doing exactly what I can control? Like, I can't control how somebody's going to feel about what I do. Like, I can't. Like, you can't control other people. You can't control their opinion. You can't control the way they feel. Yes, you can influence them, but that's not the same thing. So am I doing it to get a specific reaction out of somebody, or am I doing it because, you know, am I working on this project because I think it's important? Mm-hmm. Right? Or like, what about this project? Even if you don't think it's necessarily important, because that's what, you know, jobs are. There's a lot of things we have to do. Like, am I doing everything in my power to help this succeed? You know, or like doing my part in that. Like, that's a much easier question to answer. And like, you don't get stuck on expectations. So control is something I go to reflection with. Am I focused on the outcome or on the process?
Mm-hmm. Right. And in the book, I think you had this great quote by the Dalai Lama. He said that if there's something that you can control, it is related to worry. If there's something you can control, you shouldn't worry about it. And if it's something you can't control, you shouldn't worry about it either, because there's nothing you can do about it. I'm sure I botched that
Close
quote.
Enough.
But I thought that was a great way to think about it, and one quote that I actually hadn't heard before. And I guess related to that, so say if a person is stuck in some task, or they want to accomplish a goal that they have, yet they're worried it won't happen, or they're really stuck in the mud, how can the bullet journal help them in that situation? Like say they want to quit their job and start a business, or start a side hustle, something like that, and they're stuck. Right. They're kind of stuck in the mud. How can the bullet journal help?
Well, in my opinion, I feel like you shouldn't quit your job and start that.
Uh-huh.
In my opinion, like, I feel like we convince ourselves, because we see it all day long. It's like, the way that I changed my life was like I burned all my bridges and moved to the beaches. You know, like that. In my experience, that is a very, very rare occasion. Like, I've met many people who have done that and ended up right back at their desk a year later. Right. So for me, I would say that a lot of times people are stuck because they're scared to begin. What if it doesn't work? right? Or what if I look stupid doing it? You know, when you try something new, you take the responsibility for what happens, and that's true. And I think the larger you blow it out of proportion, the less likely you're going to be to actually take the first step. So for me, the way that I go about this, and this is what I try to talk to people about in the bullet journal, explain, is like, what is the smallest possible thing that you can do now to move towards where you want to be? Right? Like, you hate your job, you can't wait to get out of there, you want to do this whole other thing. Chances are you're not doing that thing. Right? A lot of time, you have this idea. I want to make this app. I want to start this company, whatever. Start while you're at your job. You know, if you can't find time to work on it even a little bit, then chances are you're not going to find the time when you have nothing else to do. Right? Like, you should you should feel the pain. I honestly believe that. Like, because no matter whatever it is that you want to do, and that even if you are passionate about something, like, it's not going to be great every day. So try it out, like, just a little bit at a time. Okay, you want to start a business. Okay, so what does that business do? Do you know anything about that business? No. Okay, maybe you take classes to begin with. You take classes and you're like, oh, you know what? This is really not interesting to me. You've lost nothing. However, and you start by asking yourself really small questions, like in your to-do list in the day. You're like, oh, let's say you want to launch a website that sells, like, I don't know, pet goods, right? Like, I love pets. Like, this is what I want to do. Okay. So do you know anything about, like, running an online business? Do you know anything about, like, a website? Do you have the finances to pay somebody else for this? Like, these are all questions that you can be asking yourself. And this is not to stop you from doing it. It's about you finding the path that's going to allow you to do that. So you start every day, start asking yourself questions. What do I not know? Like, what is a small thing I can do to move this forward? Can I actually do this in addition to my job? Often the case is yes. Like, for most of my career, I've had the day job and then the side hustle, and it's got the side hustle for a reason. And I've made the switch multiple times, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I made the switch, like, I pulled a hard line. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this. And in my experience, that never worked, right? You just end up being like, oh, now I'm out of a job and I have this business that I have no idea about. Or what has worked multiple times is just figuring out how to get it going, right? You get it going and see what happens, and then you learn from there while you still are supported. So you're not losing anything, and you're gaining a lot of experience and knowledge. And then, like, you can transition eventually. Like, it will be a natural thing. One day you'll be making enough money to be able to support yourself on the side hustle, right? Like, so you can transition very quickly. And if you happen to lose your job halfway through because you just can't deal anymore, well, I would suggest that you figure out how can you sustain this project that you want, and that might be through getting another job. Like, when I was younger, the one company I was working for closed, and I was out of work, but so I was like, okay, this is a great time to start my own, like, internet company. I'll design websites or something. I'd done a lot of freelance before. I'm like, this will be fun. And at first I just didn't find any clients. So I just started cater waitering, right? And it wasn't, of course it's a pride thing. You're like, oh, I'm just going to do this or bust. And I don't believe that that's ever been helpful. Sure. So, like, I wore the penguin suit and, like, served drinks to people in museums while I slowly got customers until one day I could give back the uniform. So I would say that the first thing is to try to reduce the fear as much as possible. Figure out what small thing, anything you can do right now to move you towards that other thing. And then, like, find another opportunity and find another opportunity.
So in that process, you have the end goal in mind, obviously, but are you working backward to develop the small tasks that you have to do? Or is it more of, hey, this is what I can do today, we'll see how it goes, and then I'll think of the next step after I get feedback from the first step?
I think both are okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the expectation should be significantly lower. I have no problem with people like setting like really, really intense goals, but I think the only expectation should be to like see where it goes. Because I feel like a lot of times people fail at their side hustle because they set the expectation of, some kind of unreasonable expectation. Like you have no idea where your side hustle will take you. And that's kind of an exciting part. And most of the time, at least in my own experience, that side hustle will completely transform by the time it's actually up and running, right? From like a pet store to like, you're going to make only like dog beds. Like that's what it ended up being. And it's great because you learned so much along the way that like you could really focus down on this one thing that you can own and that you're excited about. Like a lot of times when we have these ideas, they start off really big and broad, and that's okay. Start there, but like start figuring out where you fit into that goal. And I feel like that's a very small, granular, iterative process.
Mm-hmm. And along with that, in the book, you also mentioned the power of time boxing or blocking off a certain time for tasks. And I thought that was a really important point because sometimes you can be working on something and I think it's the idea of Parkinson's law, right? Where the amount of time you allocate toward a task is the amount of time you'll spend on it. So time blocking for whatever goal you're pursuing is really important. Can you maybe speak about that more and kind of your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about time a lot. And I guess my obvious conclusion that I've arrived at is that you can't make time. You can only take time. Or time, better said, can only be taken, right? And if you don't take it, it'll be taken from you. And it'll be taken from you by your responsibilities, by the outside world, and every other possible distraction, right? So the first thing is to be, I would say, like almost on the offense about scheduling your time. So figuring out where in your calendar you just like put these firewalls, essentially. Like even if it's half an hour a day, like from 8:30 to 9 o'clock, I work on my project. That's what I do. That's it. It's not like, when am I going to work on my project? Oh, I'll do it next week. It's like, I feel as I've mentioned before, like what tiny step can you take towards this? The first one is like figuring out when you're going to work on it.
Yeah.
Like that's a very small, manageable step. You want to start that company? Okay. When are you going to start working on that? It's like, oh, like in 2 weeks and when this happens and when the sun's align. And it's like, no, start working on it like tomorrow and start 10 minutes. And maybe in those 10 minutes, you start writing down your ideas. And then tomorrow you spend the 10 minutes figuring out what the name is. It's these tiny little steps. But the only way that's going to happen, in my experience, is if it becomes a regular habit and that you're very, very protective of your time, specifically for this personal project. During the day in the office, like obviously time management is important, but when it comes to some like a real personal goal, something you believe in, like if you don't protect that time, nobody else will. Mm-hmm. And it will be taken away from you.
Yeah.
So you have to be like on the offense about that. And again, it can start really small.
Yeah, that's all great stuff. Just being deliberate and prioritizing what you want to work on. And just to wrap up here, I always ask my guests one thing that listeners can do today to implement the lessons or insights that my guests discuss. So I'd like to ask you the same thing. And we've been talking about some steps that listeners can take right after they listen to this, but what would be the one thing that you'd suggest they do?
Well, if they're interested in bullet journal, I would invite them to take a look at bulletjournal.com, where there's a 5-minute tutorial. And even if they don't want to hop into it as a whole, it's designed to be modular and like take the piece that you think will make a difference in your life and build from there. And then I would not pay attention to all the things that you see online, because there's some very, very elaborate and beautiful interpretations. But at its core, the bullet journal is very simple and very lean. So I would start with the piece that works for you and build on that.
Sounds great. Well, Ryder, this has been terrific, and I encourage everyone to at least go to bulletjournal.com and try it out, and they may be surprised at how their life changes. And if listeners want to get in touch with you or learn more about the bullet journal, should they go anywhere besides bulletjournal.com?
Bulletjournal.com is the best place.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Ryder. This has been a great discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, that was Ryder Carroll, the creator of the Bullet Journal and the author of the Bullet Journal Method. While the Bullet Journal can take some getting used to, it can provide massive value in your life. As we discussed in the episode, the best way to learn more about the Bullet Journal is by visiting bulletjournal.com. But I'd also recommend picking up the Bullet Journal Method if you want to dig deep into how the Bullet Journal can help you. If you have any experience with the Bullet Journal or have some feedback on my conversation with Ryder, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. You can email me at adam@thepowerofbold.com, or you can get in touch through the podcast social media pages. With all of that said, thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Power of Bold. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and check out thepowerofbold.com for show notes and a transcript of this episode. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Power of Bold. For show notes and a transcript of this episode, visit thepowerofbold.com. Feel free to get in touch by visiting our Facebook and Twitter pages. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play. We'll see you next time.